Welcome to General Psychology. I'm Ryan Keith. You know, a couple of years ago, I read an article in an online magazine that really drove me nuts. In this article, they reported on a then recent scientific finding in which psychological researchers and neuroscientists asked people to press one of two buttons while their brains were being scanned with a functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI machine. This machine is able to tell scientists in real time what your brain is doing while you're completing some sort of a task. And regularly, the scientists were able to identify that predictably certain parts of people's brains lit up or activated before they were consciously aware of deciding to press one button or the other. Now, on its own, this finding was revolutionary and really exciting. But the way it was reported, just as a psychologist or a neuroscience, drove me crazy. When publications reported on this finding, they said that there was now evidence that your brain made decisions before you did. That your brain would come to conclusions and make you do things before, well, you had drawn those conclusions. Now, it's entirely possible that you're thinking the same thing I am, but if not, I just want you to bear with me for a moment as I ask that question that, well, if you're not your brain, what are you? You see, going all the way back to the case study of that guy Phineas Gage, remember he was the railroad worker that you read about in your textbook where an explosion drove a metal pipe up through the front of his brain and changed the way that he acted, the way that he felt, the way that he reacted to everything about him? Well, ever since that initial study, over the course of the 20th and now the 21st century, we've identified more and more things that your brain does and is involved with. Everything from, of course, your ability to do math and see the world, to how you feel about things and what your personality is like, what your beliefs are like, and where your memories are stored. The result of this, of course, is that we're able to identify more and more stuff that your brain does, and there appears to be an ever-diminishing role for whatever it is, if anything, that lies outside the scope of your brain. The result is that we end up looking at people and we end up looking at their brains with an increasingly what we would call mechanistic perspective, that we look at people as a piece of equipment or a piece of machinery, the same way we would look at a smartphone or a computer or many other animals like fish or even dogs or cats. The whole focus here is to look at people in terms of inputs and outputs. Whether we talk about neuroscience or behaviorism that you read about in your chapter on conditioning and learning, or the work of B.F. Skinner and his perspective on personality in your chapter on personality, the result is that we end up questioning, well, if your brain is a piece of equipment, which, well, it is, and a piece of equipment will always function the same way given the same situation and the same inputs, shouldn't your brain always give the same outputs given the same situation? I mean, let me ask you to do something really quickly while you're watching this video. You can feel free to pause the video while you do this, but I want you to just take out your phone. I want you to wake up your phone, and I want you to open the browser, whether that's Chrome or Safari or some other browser. Go ahead and just do that right now. Okay, now I want to ask yourself why your phone did that. Did your phone do it because you made it do it? Or did your phone do it because, well, it wanted to, given what you asked it to do? Chances are you're going to say, well, it's silly. A phone can't think for itself, but what if it could? Did it do it because it wanted to, or because the situation made it do it? Does it really matter? We'd say the same thing about people. Your brain is an incredible piece of equipment, but it's a supercomputer, built of supercomputers, the most complex piece of equipment in the known universe. But it's still a piece of equipment, and any calculator, any computer, given the same input, will always give the same output. This kind of a perspective brings us back to an argument that has been happening for centuries, for millennia, what we might call the free will versus determinism debate. Free will is something that most of us like to believe in. We like to believe that we can exercise an element of free will to do what we want, when we want, the way we want, and that we make decisions, not as a result of some programming we've received or as a result of some internal or external force, but that we do it due to force of will, that we exert our control on the world around us, or at the very least, on our own actions. But a theorist like B.F. Skinner would say that this sort of thing just isn't true, and he would be joined by the ranks of other behaviorists like E.L. Thorndike and John Watson, or he would be joined by the Freudians and the Neo-Freudians, guys like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Karen Horney. They believe that you might think you know why you do what you do, but in reality, you do these things for all sorts of unconscious reasons. Now, I'm going to guess that this is not at all the way that we want to think about the world. I like to believe that I do the things I do because I want to do them. But somebody like B.F. Skinner would ask you to think, for example, about why you are extroverted or introverted. If you're extroverted, chances are you say that you're extroverted, you like to interact with people because you like to interact with people, and that's it. It's just your choice. But if we trace back to see how long you've been an extrovert, chances are if you're extroverted now, you were extroverted in high school. And if you were extroverted in high school, you were extroverted in middle school and elementary school. And we can trace this all the way back to when you were a tiny little baby and the very first time someone lifted you out of a crib and you smiled and cooed. And in response to that interaction, they smiled and they showered you with kisses and they lifted you in the air and they told you what a beautiful, wonderful little baby you were. Or perhaps you're introverted, and this goes all the way back to the time that someone picked you up out of a crib, and instead of crying, maybe you weren't feeling so great, you kind of sniffled, you kind of cried, and nobody really is excited by a cranky baby, and you could tell how they weren't all that excited to hold a cranky little baby, and they kind of held you up and then half dropped you in the crib, teaching you at the very beginning that interacting with people maybe isn't that great. So that the next time you interacted with somebody, you held back, you didn't interact all that deeply with them. That every interaction you had confirmed that initial belief, that people just weren't that great. So that no matter how we trace it, the person you are now is irreversibly linked to the person you were a decade and a half or 2 decades ago, and how those early experiences, in a very real way, may have programmed you to be the person you are today. The only other alternative is that these qualities sit in your genes. You're a result of your brain and your brain's functioning as a result of both your environment and your genetics. But no matter how we look at that perspective doesn't leave a whole lot of room for what we might call free will. Now, perhaps you're still questioning this idea. Maybe you say, but I love free will. I want to believe in free will. And I'll just posit one question. That question is, how does free will work? Where does it come from? If you are a result of your brain, this piece of equipment, and equipment operates according to rules, then where does this chaotic free will, this thing that doesn't follow all of the other natural laws of the universe, where does that come from? You know, this idea of free will versus determinism parallels something else that you guys are really focused on this week, which is social psychology and what we call the person-situation debate in social psychology. You see, social psychology is in many ways the direct opposite to personality psychology. Personality psychology is all about who you are and how you got to be that way and what it is that makes you a distinct quality individual. In contrast to this, the findings of social psychology frequently come to find, in fact, nearly always come to find, that what we do is not a result of who we are, but a result of our situations, much as Walter Mischel in the podcast episode, The Personality Myth, explains. We like to think of ourselves as good people or bad people, as nice people or mean people, as moral people or degenerate criminals, that this is some sort of inherent quality. But going back to the earliest studies done in social psychology, we see that people do things as a result of the situation in which they find themselves. One of the original classic studies performed on men in seminary, a training school to become priests, looked at a number of priests who were going to go give a sermon on the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, if you're not up to date on your Bible studies, to keep it short, the story of the Good Samaritan is about doing good deeds for people, even if they're not people just like you. So these guys were going to walk across the campus of their religious institution to go deliver a story on the Good Samaritan to a congregation. And halfway from where they started to where they were to deliver the sermon, these potentially good people came across a man who was apparently in need of assistance. He was ailing, he was injured, he needed help then. And you might ask yourself, well, what would these priests in training do? These men who are being trained to be the best among us, on their way to deliver a sermon about doing the right thing. Well, the study found that their likelihood to help really depended on one thing and one thing alone, and that was how much time they had to get across campus. If they had 20 minutes to get from where they started to where they were to deliver the sermon, more than 3/4 of the men were likely to help. If they had as few as 8 minutes, in contrast, just enough time to get there, that number would drop to fewer than a third. The result here is that social psychology would tend to say that everything we do is a result of the situation in which we find ourselves, or begrudgingly, a social psychologist might admit that our genetics come into play in some way. But there is one thing that's really interesting that we all tend to do. Regardless of how we feel about the role that the situation or our individual personality comes into play, we are all really quite gifted at trying to figure out whether or not we do something because of ourselves or because of the situation. Now, in situations in which we have a lot of information that says that we do something because of the situation, we make external, what are called external or situational attributions. We attribute the cause of our behavior to the situation. If somebody speeds up in a car alongside you and cuts you off and you can't help but run into them because they slam on the brakes, you're gonna say it's their fault, right? At the same time, if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of evidence for how the situation made you do something, maybe you worked really hard to study for an exam and you got an A, you'll make an internal or a dispositional attribution saying that you did it because of who you are. Now, we also call these kinds of attributions a result of insufficient justification or over-justification. If you have a lot of information saying that the situation is the reason why you did something, we call this over-justification, that maybe it's not the situation at all, it's really you, but that all that extra information made you likely to do that thing. At the same time, if there's not a lot of evidence for why you would do something, you fall prey to insufficient justification. You say, well, there's not a whole lot of evidence for why I would do this. It must be because of me. Now, why am I getting into this? Well, it's because it goes all the way back to how we train people and why we train them the way we do, why we are who we are, and how we decide the difference between us or the world around us and why we do our things. You see, many of us have heard that if a carrot doesn't work, we need to make use of a stick. If we spare the rod, we spoil the child. And that if we are going to encourage someone to do something, we need to give them lots of reinforcement. If we're going to get someone to stop doing something, we need to give them heavy, heavy punishments. Now, you've already watched my videos on the difference between reinforcement and punishment and why punishment's not that great, but a researcher in social psychology, Leon Festinger, noticed something really interesting about when people say that something was because of them or because of the situation they were in. He asked a number of participants in a study to come take part in the study, and he told them that they were going to be Confederates. In other words, they were going to be an actor in the study. Now, this was false. They were really the subjects of the study, but he told them that they were part of the experiment, that they had to take part in some sort of really meaningless, really menial, boring task, counting matchsticks or sorting coins into tubes. And after they had done this thing for an hour, he was going to ask them to lie to another participant who was really an actor, but to lie to them about how much fun it was, that they had to stand up there and say it was the most fun that they'd ever had, it was the most interesting thing that they had ever done. And what he did is he split these participants up into two groups, these liars, into two groups. One group, he said, well, hey, you know, this is really tough, lying is a hard thing to do, and I understand this really is not something that you really want to do, so I'm going to pay you $20 to complete this task. The other group, he'd say, well, you know, I really appreciate you working very hard. Lying's not an easy thing to do. This is a boring task. But, you know, our lab, we don't have a lot of money. I wish I could pay you more, but I will give you the whopping king's ransom of $1 for lying to this other group, right? And then at the end, he asks people, says, I know that you're really just an actor taking part in this. They weren't really. But I want you to rate how much you actually enjoyed the task. Now, I want you to ask yourselves, which group do you think enjoyed this task, this really boring task more? The ones who got paid $20 to do it, the ones who got paid a single dollar to do it? In the end, what Festinger found was that the group who was paid $20 to do it liked it way, way, way not at all. They super duper thought it was just boring and terrible. Whereas the group who was paid $1 to do it, they're like, man, this was really great. I had this time to focus. I got in the zone. I really just it was like a Zen experience. I loved it. It was great. It doesn't make any sense because you'd figure we would love to do something we get paid lots of money to do. But you see, if you're in a situation where you're given a really obvious reason why you did it, you were paid $20. You're put in a situation to fall prey to over-justification and to make an external or situational attribution. Of course it's the situation that made you do it. Of course the situation is the reason you did it. You earned $20 to do it. Whereas in contrast, if you're in a situation where you cannot possibly blame it on it, you're not a sucker. You wouldn't work for an hour and a half for a single dollar. There's only reason why you would do that, and that's because you actually enjoyed it, because it was actually good. Walking away from this, we can take one more thing away in terms of how to let people think they have free will when they really don't. If you're trying to encourage your child to do their homework, you might be tempted to pay them lots of money or give them lots of compliments or give them ice cream every single time they do something right. There was Ruger in the background. But if you give them a huge reward every time they do it, they'll tell themselves they're doing it because they get those rewards, and they'll be more likely to stop it and less likely to take the lesson with them into the future. Similarly, if you want your child to stop doing something, you might be frustrated or angry, or you just really want a very powerful message, so you yell or scream or have a big punishment or spank them. And in the end, your child will stop that behavior right then. Stop it right then. It's really good at suppressing that behavior. But the lesson they take away is that they stop doing it because you made them stop. If you really want your child to stop, and to stop doing it 100% forever, don't punish them in a huge way. Teach them the lesson, explain why it's wrong, give them a small punishment, and in the end, the only conclusion that they'll allow themselves to walk away with is that they stop doing this thing, not because you were a jerk, but because they know what the right thing is, and the right thing is to do what you ask them to do. So, free will, determinism, the person, the situation, internal and external attributions, they explain a lot of who we are and why we do what it is we do. Until next time, I'm Ryan Keith.